evening. I can't help but smile, one, because Kyle left me a funny note up here, but two, because it's kind of a role reversal for him and myself, and it's interesting to put yourself in a different perspective from time to time. This evening we're going to be discussing the parable of the fig tree, the lesson of the fig tree, in Matthew chapter 24. This particular parable is found in three different locations: Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. But just out of simplicity's sake, we're just going to mostly focus on Matthew 24 this evening. So I wanted to pose a question this evening. How many of you have noticed the trees on the mountains changing color? Looks like everyone's noticed that. You know, that's something that's some people take for granted because they don't have that in some parts of the country. But it's something I notice every year, and it always marks the change of a new season, and that being the season of fall. And as many of you probably already know, September 22nd, this past Thursday, was the first day of fall. And much like the trees changing color, so is this lesson of the fig tree found in Matthew 24, in that it is a sign of things to come. If you would, please turn with me to Matthew 24, starting in verse 32, and we'll read that. This is a short parable, but I think there's a lot that can be learned from that. Let me start off by saying that I don't know all the answers to this the parable and the surrounding context, but I do think I can offer up some items for consideration this evening. Starting in verse 32, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." So just by reading that, it might be a little bit confusing, and you may not know exactly what's being referred to there. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to look at the whole context surrounding this parable. And in doing so, we'll start in Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 1. And this beginning part kind of sets up the whole preface of why he even told the parable to begin with. "Jesus left the temple and was going away, and when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, he answered them, 'You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.'" And in my research, I looked up Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, and he wrote of this temple that was here. And he informs us that some of these stones were 75 feet long, 12 feet high, and 18 feet wide. He also describes the crowns, shields, goblets, chains of gold given to it by Agrippa, and a golden vine with vast clusters given by Herod. The temple was built with white limestone, its beauty and strength admired by all nations. It required 46 years to build it at the hands of some 10,000 craftsmen. It's no wonder that the disciples were amazed by this feat. But Jesus kind of makes them understand this here in verse 2, when he answers them, and he says, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And in Josephus' account of this destruction that happened, there are people that didn't even believe that anything ever did exist there to begin with. It was such a vast destruction of this structure that people couldn't even believe that anything ever stood there. That's how vast it was. And imagine taking 46 years and 10,000 people to build something, and then all of a sudden it's destroyed. So this no doubt got the attention of the disciples. Continuing on in verse 3. "As he sat down on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? It's important to note here that this was a twofold question that the disciples asked Jesus. He starts with, tell us when these things will be and what will be the sign of your coming, and second part, and of the end of the age. Now, it's important to notice that because Jesus did not say anything about the end of the age when he told them about the destruction of the temple. He didn't even imply that. And this will bear some importance as we get on through this context. So again, it's two-part question, twofold question. When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Continuing on in verse 4, and Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. And this term, birth pains, is an interesting term. This indicates that there will be a time of suffering prior to the Messianic age. And Old Testament prophets used the metaphor to depict terrible sufferings in general. Continuing on in verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to the tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And there many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. That's again the second warning of these false prophets and false teachers. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So in verses 12 and 13, it's interesting to note that some will fall away due to their love growing cold. However, the one who endures will be saved. Now, it's unclear if this is a physical saving or is this an eternal saving. I think either one would apply. Also in verse 14, we'll again read that. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Jesus tells us that this event will be used to proclaim the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And this destruction of Jerusalem occurred in 70 AD. It's also interesting to note, and if you will turn over with me to Colossians in chapter 1. Starting in verse 23. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became minister. Now, Colossians was written in around 61 or 62 AD, so we see here that this has already been written and this has already taken place. And we can also turn and look in Colossians 1, chapter 6. Which has come to you as indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and increasing. And we can back up in verse 5 to kind of get the context there. Actually, let's look in verse 4. Since we heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and of the love that you have for all the saints, because of the hope laid up for you in heaven, or this you have heard before the world of truth, the gospel, which has come to you as indeed in the whole world. So we see here that the gospel has already been delivered to the whole world at this point. Moving on to verse 15 of Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. In verse 15, this is this is a reference back to Daniel 9, chapter 9, verse 27, the abomination of desolation. Jesus clarifies here that the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy will be found in the Roman destruction of the temple in AD 70. This refers to Jerusalem being surrounded by the Roman armies, the abomination, which equals the Gentile army, the desolation, which equals the destruction of Jerusalem. In we'll now read verses 16 through 21. This is where Jesus gives his warning to the people of what they can do when this time comes. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is in the housetop do not go down and take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not has been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been stopping in verse 21. Jesus warns again of all those from Judea to flee the mountains. No one is to turn back, even if they forgot their cloak, and pregnant women and women with nursing infants should pray that their flight may not be in the winter or at the time of Sabbath, because it will be very hard for them. This tribulation will be the worst yet, and the worst that will ever be. So he points out the importance of them recognizing these signs that he's already given them. And the reason why it's important is because of this tribulation that they will soon face. In verse 22, and in those days, if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. And this is one of those areas where I'm not completely sure what's being spoken of here, but I believe it's talking about the Jewish race. And if those days had not been cut short, the Jewish race would have been destroyed. But because of the elect, those Jewish Christians who did believe, those days would be cut short, and some of them would be saved. We'll continue on in verse 23. Then if anyone says to you, "Look, here's the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. And again, he did tell them beforehand. This is in fact the third time that he's warned them of these false Christs, false prophets, reaching out and trying to proclaim that they are Christ. In verse 28, so if they say to you, "Look, he is in the wilderness," do not go out. If they say, "Look, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. I believe this to be a message that Christ will, when he comes in his second coming, which we will get to as we get further along in this text, Christ in his second coming will come for everyone. Everyone will know that he is there. So this morning here in verse 28, if he was just in the wilderness or up in an inner room, he'd be hidden from other people. And that's not the message that's being told to them here by Jesus. He's saying, don't get confused with my second coming. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the destruction of Jerusalem here. So don't believe them if they come to you and say that. And he furthers that point with verse 27. For as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. I think he uses this imagery of lightning because it's something that you notice. It's a flash. It's something that happens very suddenly, just like Christ's second coming will be. It will be very quick, and everyone will know that it is occurring. In verse 28, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Some versions actually use, in place of vultures, they'll use eagles. And this corpse equals the dead nation of Israel, and vultures or the eagles equals the Roman army who acted as vultures to consume the nation. It's interesting to note here as well that when the temple was destroyed, let me back up. In the temple was contained in a certain place in the temple was the lineage of all the Jewish people, and their lineage was tracked there on some form of document or something. And that was all destroyed whenever the temple was destroyed. And so the nation that we have now, who claims to be the current nation of Israel and of Jerusalem, is not what was spoken of back here. No one has the lineage. No one knows who's the direct descendants. They don't know what tribes they were in. No one knows if they're from the tribe of Levi. So there can be no priests. And that was part of this total destruction that was to occur. And the reason that this was to occur is, in my understanding of it, is because the Jewish people offered up Jesus to be sacrificed. And this was their punishment that would come. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. I'd like for us to turn to Genesis chapter 37 here. Genesis 37, starting in verse 9. And this is the story of Joseph, and he's going to describe here one of the dreams that he had. And then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come and bow ourselves to the ground before you? Now, I bring this point up because I believe there's a direct correlation here between the sun, the moon, the stars, that's described here in Joseph, with Joseph here. You know, his father's immediate response was, what are we to bow down to you as well? Your mother and I, are we to bow down, and your brothers to bow down to you? Now, that seems like an odd statement to say when he's talking about stars, but his father recognized very quickly that this is talking about the rulers around the world would bow down to him. And I think also so here in this context, when we were talking about the moon not giving its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, I think we're talking about the whole world will notice this event, and it will affect many different things. So again, it's important to keep in mind that up until this point, we're still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. No mention here is made by Jesus of his second coming. And again, we'll read in verse 32, From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So we see here the fig tree in this way that Jesus has this excellent way of dumbing things down so easily to understand. We see that the sign of what is to come is these branches and their turning of the leaves coming out into bloom. That's the sign. The event is that the end is near for Jerusalem. Or in this case, summer is around the corner. And notice in verse 35, Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Jesus is telling them here that as powerful as heaven and earth is, his words are much more powerful. They will never pass away. Even after this earth is gone, his words will remain. If you would please turn to Hebrews 9 and verse 28. Hebrews 9:28. So again, up until this point, we've been talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And as we noted earlier, this was not something that Jesus started out to explain to the disciples, but this is a question that they had. And they were confused. They thought that the destruction of Jerusalem would also happen at the destruction of the world. They were confused by this, and Christ goes to set this straight. But to prove the idea of Christ's second coming is found here in Hebrews 9, verse 28. So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with the sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. So as we continue on in Matthew chapter 24, he makes this transition of talking about his second coming. Starting in verse 36, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows. I want to pause there. It's of note to notice this word, but. This is an adversational particle, according to the scholars. This stresses the difference between the previous material and that which follows. So this word, this small three-letter word, is very important because it signifies a change of what Jesus was just talking about to what he is now talking about. Again, in verse 36, but concerning that day, what's important about that day? It's a singular word. It's a single day that will happen. Previous to this, he's talking about all these signs that would happen and the days that would come up to that point. So it's important to note here that he's stressing the difference between that day and all the days previous, because this is a singular version of that day. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. And he goes on to explain this further in a way that they can understand. For as were the days of Noah, so were the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So backing up a little bit, we know that from this statement in verse 36, that the parable of the fig tree does not apply to Christ's second coming. The parable explains that the disciples will know about Jerusalem's demise by the signs that will happen within their generation. And it's important also to note that the word generation elicits an idea of all those who are living concurrent with Christ right then. That's the idea that's portrayed here by the generation. It's not some future generation, it's those who are currently alive when he was speaking about this. The parable explains that the disciples will know about Jerusalem's demise by the sign that will happen within their generation. But in verse 36, Jesus says that only the Father will know when Christ will come again. And he also explains that again, as Noah, the people of Noah's day, were just living, going about their daily lives, not believing what Noah had told them and not worrying about anything, so will be the second coming of Christ. There will be people who won't listen, who will just be going about their day, and suddenly it will happen, and it will be here. Continue on in verse 40. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this. Actually, let's pause there. Over in, I believe it's Luke's account, it also speaks about two people will be sleeping and one will be taken. And one writer that I came across brought up a good point here, in that these men that are in the field signifies something in the morning. The women who will be grinding signifies something that normally in their day and time would happen in the afternoon, and someone who would be sleeping would be obviously in the evening or at nighttime. So this coming would happen at all times concurrently, which couldn't actually be the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus would have to come to all at all different times of the day, and it would be all one big event. So again, this further illustrates that this is talking about the second coming of Christ and not the destruction of Jerusalem. Continuing on in verse 42, therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if a master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have left his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. How many of you here tonight, if I told you at 11 o'clock tonight, someone's going to break into your house and steal all your items, how many of you tonight would be prepared for that? I don't think anyone here would not prepare for that moment. Just like it's illustrated here, you know, if you knew when that was going to happen, you would be prepared. So the point is here, we don't know when this is going to happen, but it doesn't change the fact that we need to be prepared. All the more reason why we need to be prepared at all times so that we will be ready in the event of when it happens. Continuing on in verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of the servant will come a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour when he does not know, and will cut him into pieces and put him with the hypocrites in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We need to be ready. Verse 44 clearly states that. And I'd also like to turn over and look at Hebrews 9:27 again. We looked at verse 28 a minute ago. Hebrews 9:27. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. Man will die. We're in fleshly bodies, and these bodies will come to an end. And we know this, that upon death will come judgment. And that should be something that strikes fear in all of us and helps us to get the proper mindset when we are preparing for our death. My grandmother that I never met, one day she was getting ready for work and at 10 in the morning, and she was in the bathroom, and all of a sudden she yelled out to her husband, and that was it. On that day when she was 40 years old, she died. She had a massive brain aneurysm and suddenly died. I never got to meet her, obviously. She was very young. My grandfather then remarried later down the road, and his wife, lived a pretty good long life, but came down with Lou Gehrig's disease, and that horrible disease took 2 years to claim her life. And what's interesting to note about both these women is one died suddenly, and one had a little bit of time, but neither one of them knew the exact hour, the exact day of when their death would come. And I think, when I think of that, it's just so humbling to realize that, and that we really need to make the most of our time and to make the most of our efforts in every time that we're given, because we don't know when that will end. If you would turn with me to Proverbs chapter 1. To further this point. Proverbs chapter 1, starting in verse 24. Because I have called, and you refuse to listen, have stretched out my hand, and no one has heeded, because you have ignored all my counsel, and would have none of my reproof, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose to fear the Lord, would have none of my counsel, and despised all my reproof. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way, and have their fill of their own devices. For the simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. But whoever listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread or disaster. I don't know about you, but I want to be at ease. I don't want to have to worry. And furthermore, this is a good time to also reflect on those around us who don't have Christ's word. For those times when you think, I don't want my coworkers to make fun of me. I don't want my neighbor to think something weird about me. I'm just not the best teacher. Think about this. This is going to be their demise, whether they know it or not. This is what's going to happen to them if they don't find God. So there's 3 points that I hope we take away this evening with this parable of the fig tree. You may be asking yourself, well, what does the parable of the fig tree have to do with me today? If it's just strictly speaking about Jerusalem's demise, what does it have to do with me? Well, we all are familiar with the saying that history repeats itself. And we can all see the moral signs of our demise. We can all recognize the fact that our morality has weakened in this country. And as strong as Jerusalem was, they fell. And that's also a good warning for us. In Matthew 24, 1 through 35, it dealt with the destruction of Israel and Jerusalem. And the last point that I want to make sure we know is we don't know when Christ will come again. That's easily spoken of in verses 36 through 51. But, one of the things that I always have to remind myself of is that the Bible was not written with chapters, subtitles, verses. This was Jesus talking to his disciples. And just because that, the parable of the fig tree doesn't seem to play into maybe an application to us today, we don't have to look any further than looking at, the parable of the 10 virgins, or the parable of the talents. And Jesus really stressed for us to be prepared when he comes again. And again, not even the Son of Man knows when he will come. So that leaves us with one choice. Either be prepared at all times or don't be prepared. And I would suggest that we always be prepared. In a moment, we'll sing a song about a great day coming. That day is coming for all of us. There's nothing we can do to hide from that day. There's nothing we can do to delay that day. That day will come. And I'd like for us to reflect on the words of that song as we stand and sing. And if you need to make your life right or need to confess of any sin in your life, now is a good opportunity to do that.